For a little background, the events of this story took place when I was 21 years old. I'm a male and have always been somewhat awkward. I was never in the popular crowd and never really found my clique in high school. I've also always been pretty bad at talking to girls and or asking them out. It's not that I'm really overly nervous, I just never really know the right thing to say or carry on the conversation. I have a twin sister who is the exact opposite. She was always popular, had a ton of friends, and was usually in a steady relationship. She was a bit of a social butterfly, and we used to joke around about how different we were from one another. It never really bothered me, and in fact, some of my fondest memories of my childhood was goofing around and poking fun at each other with my sister. Fast forward to when I was 21, right around Valentine's Day. I'm not sure if it was the constant cold weather, or the fact that my sister was hanging out with her boyfriend, but I was feeling especially lonely. I asked my sister if she would help me set up a dating profile on one of the 1,000 dating websites that are out there. We went through all of the criteria and gave it a few days to see if I got any responses. I received a few messages, but the conversations fizzled after a few exchanges back and forth. The day before Valentine's Day, I received a message from a girl who was extremely attractive and who wouldn't give me the time of day in high school. Her name was Gwen, which I very much liked because it reminded me of Gwen Stacy from the Spider-Man comics. She made talking very easy, which was awesome because I was never good at steering conversations. She laughed at my dry sense of humor and always kept the conversation going. Thinking she was possibly not who she said she was, or perhaps a catfish, I asked her to video chat with me and she complied. I was shocked when it was really her. I couldn't believe it. We talked about a lot of things, the things you ask someone when you're getting to know them and clearly interested in. She eventually told me that I was one of the nicest people she had ever spoken to and that I was different than the other guys she had talked to or been with in the past. We eventually set up a plan for a date and to meet in person. When the day came, I picked her up, but not from her house. She said she had to work and I could pick her up downtown. I didn't think anything of it, so it didn't set off any red flags. We had a few drinks and then went to dinner. We had plans to go to the movies after dinner, but as I was paying the check, she said, "Let's go on an adventure." Confused what she meant by that, I asked her to clarify. She said in the bubbly voice I grew so accustomed and comfortable with, "Let's go to Blue Lakes. They have the trails there and the moonlight will be on the lake. It'll be so romantic and way better than any movie." Nervous, but excited, I said of course. But in my own mind, I liked the idea of the movies because I didn't have to worry about what to say and carry on a conversation. We drove to Blue Lakes, which is the name of this beautiful park in my hometown. It's not actually called Blue Lakes, but because the lake has a deep blue color, everybody in town calls it Blue Lakes. We got there at about 10 p.m. and was starting to get nervous and felt like I was somehow going to mess things up. I texted my sister and told her where I was and asked her to give me some kind of advice on what to do or what to say. She didn't respond right away. Thanks, sis. There was a couple of cars in the parking lot, which was weird for the time of night, but I was trying to have fun. She said, "Oh, don't be nervous about the cars. It's probably just some couples still celebrating Valentine's Day." She grabbed my hand and started walking toward one of the trails. She could have said anything at this point, and I would have went along with her. She let go of my hand and walked on the trail beside the lake. She said very loudly, "Wow, look how beautiful this place is." I thought it was kind of weird how loud she said it, but again, I didn't really care. While she was staring at the water, I checked my phone to see if my sister texted me back, and she did. It just said, "Get out of there now." Thoroughly freaked out and truly not sure why, I looked up from my phone at Gwen, who was standing right there with a smile on her face. "What's wrong, Andrew?" she said in a soft voice. I tried, but I couldn't answer. I had 100 things running through my head right now. She said in a flirtatious voice, "Don't you want to kiss me, Andrew?" I finally had the courage to respond and said, "I need to leave." Gwen laughed at me and said, "Don't be shy, Andrew. We just got here." I turned around and tried to walk out of the trail, and there were 2 guys standing there. I was frozen in fear, not sure why they weren't moving out of the way. Gwen came up behind me and whispered in my ear, "Andrew, we're not leaving yet. My friends just got here." I tried to run, but 2 more guys ran from the other side and tackled me. I'm a pretty big guy, but I couldn't hold my own against 4 guys. They held me down, taking turns punching and kicking me. It hurt, but the adrenaline from being scared kept me from being in intense pain. They tied me to a tree, stole my wallet, took my car keys, and hit me a couple more times before leaving. Gwen took my phone and threw it in the lake. Within minutes of being there tied to the tree, I saw flashing lights turn into the park. I screamed for help, and the police found me tied to the tree. They helped me down and began questioning me when my sister arrived. Apparently, as soon as I texted her, she had called the cops and rushed over herself. She was at a party and a group of guys were there, saying that they were going to jump some loser at Blue Lakes. They had an entire plan to rob him and beat him up and leave him there. My sister had exclaimed to them that they were lame and jerks and walked away, not really thinking about it until a couple of hours later when I texted her. Not taking any chances, she called the police. They were able to find one of the 4 guys, but the other 3 they couldn't find, and they also couldn't find this Gwen. All of her information online was fake, so they couldn't track her. My car had some minor damage and looked to have been used for drug usage. I only had minor injuries, including a concussion, a badly scraped arm, and some soreness from where I had been kicked. The thing that still haunts me and bothers me to this day is the motivation for this event. Was it really worth all the effort to beat a broke college kid for his wallet and his car? I had maybe a couple of $100 on me, and I canceled my credit card immediately. It just seemed like a lot of time for a small payoff. 4 years later, I still have nightmares of that night. Even though the incident could have been worse, I still have mental scars from getting attacked by a group of strangers. I'm thankful one of them did eventually come to justice, but there was a strong honor amongst these thieves, because the authorities were never able to gather any further information out of him, and all the other individuals had sort of disappeared into obscurity. I have since found an amazing girlfriend and no longer live in my hometown. Hopefully, since this story happened, dating websites have made an effort to authenticate their users, so things like this don't happen again. To all outside observers, it appeared that Dr. John Hamilton and his wife Susan had the perfect, loving marriage. In the 14 years of blissful union, John's passionate love for his spouse had led him to lavish her with expensive gifts and luxurious vacations, a brand new Porsche on their wedding day being just the beginning of a long list of romantically motivated purchases. But John wasn't just generous with his money. He was apparently generous of heart, too, and spent a great deal of time reminding Susan just how much he loved her in a variety of heartwarming ways. When Susan professed a yearning for employment, for a purpose outside of being a housewife, John gave her a job at his highly esteemed obstetrics and gynecology clinic in Oklahoma City. He was there for her in every way, and by all counts, they were a textbook case of romantic longevity. But that's what makes it all the more horrifying that on Valentine's Day of 2001, Dr. Hamilton's arrival at the family home kicked off a chain of events that would turn their perfect little world into a living nightmare. As you can imagine, in a marriage as loving as John and Susan's, Valentine's Day was held in high esteem. Every single year they were married, they exchanged gifts and cards, often having planned some kind of romantic rendezvous, be it dinner and a movie or a walk around a local park. But on Valentine's Day of 2001, John was needed in the operating room of his clinic, fairly early in the morning, too. Any exchange of gifts would have to wait until his lunch break, but just as he had promised, John ducked out of the clinic as soon as he was able and drove home to spend a romantic half-hour with his wife, after which he would have to return to another surgery. He called her name as he walked through the front door, but she didn't answer. John suspected that his wife might have some kind of surprise in store for him, and he felt a ripple of excitement run through him as he walked up the stairs towards the master bedroom. He called his wife's name again, but still there was no answer. And it was then that something caught John's eye, lying on the floor of the second-floor bathroom. It was Susan. She was in a crumpled, lifeless heap, with blood pooling underneath her. Paramedics were called to the scene, but Susan couldn't be revived. Those in attendance noted that she appeared to have been strangled with two of her husband's expensive silk neckties. But the blood on the bathroom floor was undoubtedly from the series of bloody head wounds she had due to repeated blunt force trauma, the wounds being so severe that parts of her brain were exposed, while her face was completely unrecognizable. To his absolute horror, Dr. John Hamilton was the #1 suspect in his wife's murder from the very beginning. Police have since publicly stated that there were many factors which led them to such a conclusion, the first being that there was no sign of forced entry to the home. Whoever killed Susan had the keys to the residence. It was also a crime in which nothing of value was stolen, and one in which there were no bloody fingerprints left in the bathroom, which had blood almost everywhere. This meant that there was a distinct chance that whoever killed Susan was extremely professional, incredibly lucky, or had the time and privacy to scrub the scene of incriminating evidence before the body was found. On top of that, while searching the home, police got their hands on a Valentine's Day card that Susan had written to John, presumably that year, and the message inside wasn't nearly as loving and cheerful as you might imagine. "I bought this 2 weeks ago, so I guess maybe it doesn't seem as appropriate, but I do love you. Have a great day, Susan." The contents of the card raised a lot of questions concerning the state of the Hamiltons' marriage. Evidently, it suggests that there had been some kind of incident or argument, one that had caused a degree of turmoil and somewhat soured the Valentine's feeling. As it later turned out, this incident involved Susan catching John making phone calls to a woman employed as a topless dancer. Police actually found hundreds of calls to this person on John's cell phone during their investigation, and heard from close friends of Susan that she had confessed to considering a divorce. To the cops, the explanation seemed simple. John had murdered his wife to prevent her from running off with half of his money. But at his trial, much of the local community came out in support of Dr. Hamilton and refused to believe that the man was capable of such a horrific crime, especially given that the victim was his own beloved wife. But when the paramedics who attended the 911 call John made were questioned in court, the jury began to notice some disturbing inconsistencies in his story. Hamilton testified in court that after he contacted emergency services, he had gotten to work trying to perform CPR on his wife's bloodied corpse. And this appeared to be true, as the paramedics confirmed that when they arrived, John had been performing chest compressions. But as people who perform CPR on an almost daily basis, the paramedics noticed something peculiar about John's technique. It was incredibly ineffective. From a regular person with no first aid training, that could be understandable, but John was so bad that it almost looked like he wasn't actually trying to revive Susan at all, which for a medical professional is very suspicious. John also claimed that he had tried performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on his wife, but the paramedics claimed that John had no blood on his mouth or face when they arrived. There was so much blood around the victim's head that there was no way John could have performed mouth-to-mouth and not gotten any on him. Some of Susan's blood was also found on the steering wheel of Dr. Hamilton's car, and despite his claim in court that he had simply moved the vehicle to make room for emergency vehicles, a prosecutor was able to make use of the overall suspicion to claim that this was evidence that John had been considering an escape attempt. At one point during the trial, the prosecution's case against Dr. Hamilton appeared to be floundering. Hamilton's defense attorney had brought a number of key character witnesses to testify in court, and all had built a picture of John as nothing but a loving husband, and he believed that the nail in the prosecution's coffin would be the testimony of a crime scene investigator named Tom Bevel, an expert on blood splatter at crime scenes. Bevel was essentially brought in to confirm that the blood splatter on Dr. Hamilton's shirt, the same one he was wearing during his attempt at CPR, was consistent with a man simply trying to revive his murdered wife while in a state of extreme panic and grief. At first, Tom Bevel did indeed testify that much of the blood splatter could well have been from the doctor's attempts at CPR, but as it turned out, Bevel had noticed something that other investigators had overlooked. He had made note of the small flecks of blood that could be found on the inside of Hamilton's right sleeve, a pattern he had seen many times before on the clothing of people who had killed someone with a blunt object. In the seconds that followed, the courtroom was deathly silent. An expert defense witness had testified against the person they were supposed to be defending, and in just a few words, Tom Bevel had condemned Dr. Hamilton to prison. When later asked why he had made the decision to essentially act as a witness for the prosecution, Bevel claimed he just had to tell the truth. He said he had sworn on oath something that override any allegiance he may have had to his client. After that, it only took 2 hours for a jury of his peers to find John Hamilton guilty on the charge of first-degree murder, whereafter a judge sentenced him to life in prison. Those that followed the case were highly disturbed by the sudden turn of events. John had and still does maintain his innocence even to this day, but more and more evidence points to the idea that he killed his wife in cold blood. His defense team even floated the idea that he must have been innocent because the guilty timeline would mean that John went to work and performed flawless surgeries right after murdering the love of his life. This might well be true, but in the light of the guilty verdict, it's all the more damning, because it suggests that Dr. John Hamilton was able to beat his wife's skull in on Valentine's Day, then remain calm and collected enough to go and perform complicated medical surgeries. And if it's true, then maybe a more fitting name for Dr. Hamilton would be Dr. Death. On a rainy Valentine's Day evening in February of 1971, 19-year-old Jesse McBain drove over to meet his girlfriend, Patricia Mann, at her college dormitory in Durham, North Carolina. They had arranged to celebrate their most romantic day of the year by attending a Valentine's dance at the nearby Watts Hospital. Patricia was studying nursing, and her practical lessons took place at Watts, so as a potential future member of the nursing staff there, she had managed to land an invitation to the dance. At approximately 11:30, Jesse and Patricia had one last dance, said their goodbyes, and began to walk back to Jesse's car. They then drove over to a deserted housing development area that would later become the neighborhood of Crowsdale. No house had been constructed yet, but a few sections of road had been laid out in an area that was shrouded by a quarter-mile's worth of greenery. Those that ventured down there were likely to find collections of beer bottles, cigarette butts strewn among the trees. It was a place people went to screw around, exactly the kind of private, out-of-the-way place the two young lovebirds might need to go to get a little alone time. Patricia's 1 a.m. curfew came and went, and her friends back in the girls' dorm assumed she'd sneak back in at some point on her tiptoes, yet little did they know that they'd never see her or her boyfriend ever again. The following morning, Patricia still hadn't returned from her date with Jesse. This was the first time the young woman had ever broken her dormitory curfew, and those close to her were quickly beginning to worry. They knew Patricia to be a deeply mature and responsible young woman who always played by the rules and took authority seriously. And to their knowledge, Jesse was an affectionate, respectful boyfriend, one that Patricia seemed very much in love with. But not even youthful romance would be able to make the young nursing student break curfew. Slowly but surely, as the day progressed, the concern of Patricia's roommates went from mild to grave. What started with a few questions turned to them calling around local hospitals in case they'd been in a car accident. They then filed a missing persons report with the Durham County Sheriff's Department, but were still so anxious that they began to physically search for their missing roommate on foot. They roamed the surrounding area, canvassed her usual hangout spots around town and on campus, until someone had the idea to go search the Lover's Lane over at the housing development. It was here that the searchers would find Jesse's empty car parked in one of the quieter spots on the development. The car was locked, and on the back seats there were 2 warm coats, presumably belonging to Jesse and Patricia. There was no damage to the car. Everything about the scene seemed perfectly in order, except of course for the fact that the last 2 people to travel in it seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. By this point, local police have informed both Jesse and Patricia's parents that their children are missing. At first, all involved had entertained the idea that the couple's disappearance was nothing more than a misguided but romantic attempt to elope, to skip town, get hitched, and settle down somewhere new. But investigating police quickly began to realize that there was something distinctly sinister about the case. There had apparently been no attempt by either Jesse or Patricia to inform anyone of their plans, not even close friends, and the idea that neither would at least leave a note or letter to a relative seemed highly unlikely. Over time, those closest to Patricia began to assume the worst. "I just got the sickest feeling in my stomach," said a cousin of Patricia's. "I just knew something terrible had happened." For 2 weeks after they were declared missing, a team of police officers and local volunteers mounted an intensive search of the surrounding area, combing through the wooded areas around Lover's Lane for any trace of the missing couple. They followed up lead after lead and tip after tip, but no one could find hide nor hair of Jesse or Patricia. With frustration mounting, police decided to widen the range of the search area and enlist the help of helicopter support and specifically trained forensic divers. But in the end, it was the misfortune of a surveyor in nearby Orange County that provided the police with their most important lead. On February 25, 1971, a full 12 days after Jesse and Patricia went missing, Robert Kirby is walking along a dirt road in the backwoods of Orange County, North Carolina, when something catches his eye. Among the trees, maybe 50 meters or so off the trail, the surveyor thinks he sees what appears to be the limb of a mannequin lying among the fallen leaves. Curious, he wanders over to check it out, but the distinct shape of a human leg he sees is not that of a plastic mannequin. It's real human flesh. He rushes to a nearby roadside diner to have someone call the police, and by the end of that, forensic investigators discovered not one, but 2 human corpses up in the woods of Orange County, and they turned out to belong to none other than Jesse McBain and Patricia Mann. Finding the young couple and decomposing was bad enough for the searchers, but the manner in which they'd obviously been dispatched of was massively disturbing to them. The couple had their hands tied, and then were made to stand back against a tree so another, larger rope could be wrapped around them. Once their killer had secured them in place, he began to torture them. Jesse's ear and mouth were both found to have blood in them, and a variety of large and small abrasions to his lips and forehead suggested he was beaten senseless before he was killed. At some point, Jesse and Patricia's killer had ripped their eyelashes off before continuing to savagely beat them. Then, when whoever had tied them up had grown tired of beating them, they wrapped rope collars around their necks, using a kind of knot that could be repeatedly tightened over and over again. We can only assume that the killer used these rope collars to slowly choke the life out of Jesse and Patricia, gradually tightening the rope collars over a drawn-out period of time until neither was able to breathe. Each of the couple's bodies had all of their valuables intact too. Jesse was still wearing an expensive wristwatch and a class ring when his body was found. Patricia was also wearing jewelry, and her purse was left back in the abandoned car. Their deaths were not part of some robbery. Their killer has absolutely no monetary gain in mind when he'd taken them. Neither were there any signs of indecent assault on Patricia. She had a great deal of bruising around her face and neck, but nothing below the waistline. There was no ulterior motive. All their killer had wanted to do was torture and kill. The investigation that followed was severely hampered by different agencies' complete lack of collaboration. For example, the FBI seemed to consider the local sheriffs as frankly beneath them, and a feeling of contempt quickly grew between the two groups. Everybody worked on the case as individuals, as Detective Tom Horn once put it. Not a lot of information was being shared by the various agencies, and the rivalry was tremendous. A lot of work was done, but it was individuals, so there were definitely some missed opportunities. Yet even with the appalling level of disorganization that pervaded, a number of likely suspects emerged as a result of some tip-top police work. Some had to be ruled out after taking polygraph tests which proved their innocence, but one of the men who failed was actually a doctor at Watts Hospital who had previously worked with Patricia Mann. When the police sought to question him again, he completely refused to cooperate and would only release his statement through a defense attorney he began to keep on retainer. This made him the #1 suspect in the entire case, and to this day there's never really been anyone else who's garnered such legitimate scrutiny. But without the proper evidence to charge him, very little action was taken against any of the supposed killers. No one ever really zeroed in on anyone, Detective Horn stated, and as a result, the case quickly went cold. 43 years later, in 2014, Detective Tim Horn was still working for the Orange County Sheriff's Department when a cousin of Patricia's, Carolyn Spivey, contacted him with some fresh information regarding her cousin's murder. Along with his partner at the time, Detective Horn opened up the previously closed case file, poring over old statements and boxes and evidence. They reanalyzed the possibilities of former suspects, considered new ones, and began to condense as much of the multi-agency information as possible into the pursuit of one solid suspect. And they succeeded. Detective Horn then contacted almost every single one of the detectives who worked on the case back in 1971 and gathered them together for a presentation. It was one which would show them how he'd pieced together multiple pieces of a decades-long puzzle, only to come to one solid conclusion, that it was the Watts doctor, a man Patricia had actually known, that had murdered her and her boyfriend, Jesse. When the presentation was finished, what followed was a prolonged silence. To all in attendance, Tom Horn's hard work had presented them the best opportunity yet to end a mystery that had persisted for almost half a century. They had their suspect, they had evidence. Now it was time to make their move. Using what's known as MVAC, Detective Horn was able to extract a DNA sample from the knotted ropes used to tie up and strangle Jesse and Patricia. An MVAC is basically a wet vacuum DNA collection system that is designed to extract strands of DNA from difficult-to-reach places. Places just like the fibrous folds in a length of rope. What came back was a DNA sample that didn't match either Jesse or Patricia, and so in all likelihood it belonged to the killer. Detective Horn then requested a DNA sample from their #1 suspect, the Watts doctor that Patricia had worked with. Horn's argument was that, after all this time, the doctor would finally be able to clear his name and prove that it wasn't him that executed the young couple. But the doctor refused, having his defense attorney contact law enforcement to release a statement in legalese. And that might just be the most suspicious thing about our doctor, because it really does raise the question of what he has to hide. Yet despite such obvious suspicion, this doctor has never been charged, and whatever new evidence led to him being asked to provide a DNA sample hasn't been shared with the public. We can only assume the Durham County Sheriff's Department are in the process of putting a serious case against the man and are trying to find some way of forcing him to give a sample of his DNA. And with that DNA sample, law enforcement might just be able to end this 40-year-old mystery of who could be cold and cruel enough to wrench a loved-up young couple away from one of the happiest nights of their lives, only to torture and eventually execute them in a secluded, wooded area, turning a romantic Valentine's night into the very last that each of them would spend on Earth. This story happened a long time ago when I was about 7. I don't think I have ever told it to anyone, and it was a very short incident, but it's been in the back of my mind ever since. Typically, my cousins would babysit me and my sister during summer and winter breaks. They were about 10 years older than us, maybe 15 to 17 at the time. One day, about a week before Christmas, they took us to the mall to do some shopping. This is one of the largest malls in my area, and it was usually always very crowded, even more so during Christmas time. The day went fine, and they even bought me a small ball which I started playing around with by bouncing it on the floor and catching it as I walked. Because of this, I was walking behind them, distracted in my own world. After we had finished shopping, we exited through the main doors, which were the most crowded, and just as we were crossing the street to go into the parking lot, some guy, my guess would be about 40+ years old, grabbed me by the hand and started pulling me to a van right across the street. I remember the van very clearly. It was one of those conversion vans popular in the 90s with drapes on the window, red with thin gray stripes running through the sides, and van doors. One of the back seat doors was open and you could see a woman sitting on the driver's seat. She was about the same age as the guy, and you can tell that the engine was running. At the time, I didn't really know what was going on. I just thought it was weird in a sort of funny kind of way. Why is this guy grabbing me? As I remembered, I thought he just got confused and grabbed me by accident, thinking I was his son or something. So I shouted my cousin's name and she quickly looked my way. She was just a few steps ahead, and as soon as she sees me, she runs to me, quickly grabs my arm with both hands, and starts shouting as loud as she can. It wasn't until I saw her freak-out face that I realized that something bad was happening. As soon as she grabbed me, the guy just lets go, gets in the van, and they drive away. They didn't really tell the cop or call mall security. They were teens, so my guess is that they didn't really know what to do. They were just happy nothing happened. As I said, this was a very crowded day. As I got older and reflected more on what happened that day, I would understand more and more the severity of the situation. I wondered what would have happened if my cousin hadn't heard me calling her name within all that noise and multitude that was crossing the street with us. I wasn't even shouting out at the top of my lungs. I just called out her name rather calmly. So I was very lucky that day. But later that year, a kid was kidnapped in a local park. It was a very famous case that made headlines all around the county. They never found the kid, and I've always wondered if it could have been the same guy. My grandfather suffered from Alzheimer's disease and passed away 2 days before Thanksgiving. My grandmother is now living alone, so my mom has spent a lot of time over there keeping her company and helping her out around the house. She went to her house on Christmas to go with my grandmother to church before the rest of the family got there, and while my grandmother was getting ready, my mom was in the kitchen on her phone checking Facebook. Out of nowhere, this old Christmas music box in one of the bedrooms started playing by itself. It was the very last part of the melody to Silent Night, Sleep in Heavenly Peace. It played that one line at normal speed and just stopped before it could loop. I'm a skeptic, and no music boxes can do this for various reasons, but hearing that it only played that one line makes me want to believe that it was my grandfather letting his family know that he was at peace and no longer suffering. Just wanted to share this story because even if it's just the mechanism becoming unjammed, it gave my mom a feeling of peace and relief when it happened. Either way, the story both touched and freaked me out at the same time. Hearing that would have given me goosebumps. I'm currently 18 and my dad passed away in an accident when I was very little in 2005. A couple of years ago on Christmas, my brother, mother, and me were watching a corny Christmas movie on Netflix for the fun of it. It was the 1998 version of Jack Frost, where a father dies in an accident but comes back to life as a snowman to be with his kid. In the other side of the room we were in, my mom had an iPod that was hooked up to a speaker. Near the end of the film, there was a scene where the dad acknowledges that he has to pass on and tells his family he loves them as he starts to melt. During this exact scene, the iPod somehow turned on by itself and started playing loud music, which startled us a little. We were kind of silent for a while after that, and we've never since talked about it. I think I can only remember it happening one time other than that, which was in the middle of the night while everyone was sleeping. Maybe it's a coincidence, but it's pretty odd that it happened at that exact moment on Christmas. We've moved multiple times since his death, too, and that happened in a relatively new apartment. If it was him, it was a pretty sweet thing for him to do.